Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome to another ARCS chat. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I'm the Association Manager for ARCS. I'm just going to do a couple quick technical notes and reminders, and I'm going to throw this over to the ARCS chat team. Just so you know, with all of our ARCS chats, as we port these out to YouTube, there is a slight delay from when we're doing our talk and when the actual discussion happens. So if you are putting something in the chat, just know there's a little bit of delay in there. If you want to participate in the chat, please be sure to sign in with your Google or YouTube account. That will allow you to play along in the comment field as we go along. And a quick programming note, our ARCS conference is coming up. It's going to be the 2 weeks in November. I encourage you to go sign up for it as soon as you can. It is $100 for members to get access to over 36 sessions. It's going to be a good time. We actually just posted some of the session descriptions to the website. So if you go to arcsinfo.org, click on the conference, you can actually look at some of the session descriptions we're planning. So without further ado, I'm going to go and hand this over to our ARCS chat hosts. They are John Robinette and Amanda Robinson, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Robin. Welcome back, everyone. Amanda Robinson here, coming to you from the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, joined again by John Robinette.
Hey, I'm John. I'm an independent collections manager based in New York City area.
Bringing in the Northeast representation. I love it. So today we are talking about the future of museum funding post-COVID and beyond. And joining us today is Katherine Wilson-Milne, who is a partner at Schindler Cohen Hochman LLP, where she focuses on art law. Katie advises clients in the art, cultural, and creative communities, including art galleries, collectors, artists, and not-for-profit organizations in the art space on transactional matters, such as the purchasing, the sale, lending, and financing of art. Katie also represents art clients in disputes involving representation, collaborations, contracts, copyright, authenticity, title, provenance, and appraisals. Basically, she's a badass. And Katie is also a co-host of the Art Law podcast, which is a monthly podcast discussing topics at the intersection of art and law. And it's highly recommended for everyone to check out. We will, of course, link it in the description box below of the YouTube channel, and we will also put it in the description of the podcast, which will come out later this week. So Katie, welcome to ARCS Chat.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, or happy to be back too.
Oh, that's right. I apologize. Katie has been with us before, and we were just talking about that. So shame on me for having a short-term memory. Actually, one of the cool things we were just talking about is that the chat that Katie was previously on is one of our most highest viewed chats on YouTube. And I would guess maybe also the podcast. Maybe you knew John. Yeah. So
the podcast.
Okay.
Flattered, cool. Very flattered.
So before we get started today, let's maybe talk a little bit, Katie, about how museums raise money and their funding operations, to give us a little bit of a background about museum funding.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And I should say to everyone in the audience, I don't work in a museum. I'm a lawyer in private practice, and I'm not a fundraiser. So although I talk about these topics a lot and I think about them and, deal with clients when they're thinking about these issues themselves, I think expertise in the audience, and I would very much welcome, comments, participation, questions, corrections, whatever anyone thinks would be useful. So that said, museums, for the most part, we're going to leave aside private museums, which are usually private operating foundations, which don't need to raise money because they are funded by their founder. So for most museums that we visit, art museums we're going to focus on today, are nonprofit organizations or public charities, and they raise money from the general public to support their charitable mission. And they're also allowed to earn income under certain circumstances without having to pay business income tax if that income is related to their charitable purpose. I'm grossly oversimplifying the IRS rules on UBIT, which is unrelated business income tax, but every institution's accountant and tax lawyer will have explained this to them. But for the most part, museums, like all public charities, raise money for their operations and their mission. And they raise money in two different buckets. One is getting donations and grants, and the other is stuff they do that people pay for. We'll call that earned income. On the donations and grants side, which makes up, at least for the big museums, most of their income, we're talking about grants from government entities, grants from foundations, private foundations, which for the most part only give to public charities, and private donations from wealthy donors and individuals or their related entities. And there's a lot of pressure. That's where the big donations come from. There's a lot of pressure to secure big streams of income through those types of donations, especially private donations. The other category is what I said I call earned income, and that could be stuff like ticket sales, licensing fees, gift shops. One thing that's actually very lucrative for museums that I was just talking to some people about recently is trips, and that will segue into the kind of impact of the pandemic on some fundraising, because a lot of this wasn't possible. But museums do trips for donors and members where they actually make a lot of money. They have events, concerts, so things like that. They also bring in income. Historically speaking, at least for museums of a certain size, it's very difficult to make a meaningful amount of money on ticket sales or the gift shop. The big money coming in is really through donations and grants. And so that's where a lot of the fundraising focus is. It's not that earned income isn't important. And I actually think for smaller institutions, it's even more important. And they make a bigger percentage of their budget through maybe ticket sales and gift shops, but the pressure really typically on the bigger institutions is on fundraising through grants and donations.
Right. I'm thinking back on some of the things like the operating expenses of current organizations and past organizations I've been a part of. And depending on the size of the institution, like how much, we called it like your gate. We're very dependent upon our gate earnings at certain institutions, given their size. And a lot of what made up our operating budget was earned income from events. Weddings especially was a very big thing, at least here in Florida. So that's a very popular opportunity. But speaking of that, what are some of the challenges that you see institutions facing when it comes to fundraising, especially as a nonprofit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this also, maybe it's helpful to think about in two parts. One is what were kind of the pre-existing challenges before, let's say, the last 2 years, long-term challenges for museum fundraising. And then what are we seeing? It's kind of raising this profile of these topics in the last couple of years, and what's kind of exacerbated the already difficult landscape. So I think, again, different size institutions have very different issues with fundraising. And, in a very long-term sense, we've seen across the country, especially in non-coastal museums and smaller museums generally, that the fundraising landscape has changed in the last, let's say, 100 years. There's been deindustrialization in places where there was a lot of money for arts and culture. Those families have either moved away or they no longer have that kind of wealth, or the seed funding they gave to an institution ran out. We have depopulating parts of the country, where it's harder to get people interested in going to museums, and also harder to get people to donate. So those are some long-term trends we're seeing in different parts of the country. And then kind of persistent challenges, relate to how museums can bring money in and what restrictions may be on the money. So let's say, for bigger institutions that are really going after the same handful of very, very wealthy donors and foundations, right? The pool is small. It's the same people that every, big museum is kind of going to for money. How do you compete and get that person/foundation to give you money rather than your, sister, friendly but competitive organization, across the city or, in a neighboring city? And that has presented a lot challenges, because a lot of the efforts of fundraising then have gone to wooing very wealthy people, which can look like, a lot of attention of the museum is being placed on those donors rather than on the constituents that the museum serves. And I think we're seeing more conversations about that now. And those kind of wealthy donors, if they're going to give their tens of millions of dollars to one institution versus another, often want to be recognized. So there's a competition for how those donors can be recognized. Is their name going to be on something? Is there going to be a new wing built in their name, a new fountain, an endowed position? And those are not typically operating expenses. Hard to put your name on an operating expense, right? Like, oh, I paid for the janitors this year, or I'm paying for the electricity. That's just not really a sexy thing for donors. So museums have always, and I think increasingly so, had difficulty fundraising for their basic operating expenses. That's stuff like janitors, electricity, storage for the art, staff, salaries, just like anything that any business would have to pay for that has a plant, physical plant. And what, donors who are giving the biggest amounts often want to do is they want to give to a new project or a new exhibition. And so that can be very helpful because those are sexy things and they can bring in more donations, interest, and visitors, but they're also cost centers. So instead of kind of paying down the existing financial needs of an institution, we see donors kind of wanting to give to something new, a new cost center, which doesn't really offset the original cost at all. So that's always a challenge, is how do we raise money for operating expenses? And I think, Amanda, as you said, often earned income goes into a lot of the operating expenses, but in many cases that's not enough. And so it's a real challenge. And I think we're seeing that conversation really peak, in the last couple of years about just the reality of needing money for operating expenses.
Mm.
Oh, and then COVID, I guess go ahead, John. Then we can talk about COVID when.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask right quick, what are the incentives for someone to give? Is it just tax incentives?
Yeah, I think it's again, grossly oversimplifying, but two things. One is, yes, we live in a tax incentivized philanthropic system. And so there are serious financial benefits to giving to charities, both during a donor's lifetime and certainly at death, to avoid the estate tax burden, either at a state level or a federal level. And it's also reputational. I mean, I don't personally use the washing terms very often, but there is a sense that that wealthy people, kind of no matter how they get their money, are using their affiliation with charitable entities to improve their reputation and make that money look like, it's from a good place. I think there's a very legitimate argument that if someone has made money, in an undesirable way, what better place for that to go than a place where they don't control it anymore and it's in the public interest? Like that seems like a great appropriation of funds from someone who may not be making the best decisions. But it certainly is true that there are reputational benefits for donors to be affiliated with institutions like museums, and that plays into them wanting that public recognition, those sort of naming affiliations.
For sure. Actually, John, I think you may have posed this in the chat. Have we gotten some feedback from listeners, or I would even encourage listeners to let us know what the challenges are that they've been facing at their institution, not necessarily the past 18 months, but in general when it comes to fundraising. Have we gotten any feedback from that yet, John?
Not yet, but did have one comment from someone asking if loan fees were a significant source of income. How does it? Do you charge a loan fee down there at your museum, Amanda?
No, I don't. And I have to say, most of the museums I've worked for have been affiliated with the university in some sense. So they're even less inclined to do that because the mission of not only our institution, but our parent organization is for education, and we wouldn't want to put a financial hindrance on that.
Yeah.
I have always wondered that in terms of earning income. I have found that like traveling exhibitions seem to be a way that institutions have tried to earn an income.
Yeah.
Or offset costs like operating costs or what have you. I haven't really heard about loans being something that have
Yeah.
really done that outside of just kind of covering the costs of facilitating.
Yeah, exactly. My hunch is that it doesn't bring in that much income unless it's just a huge amount of objects, unless it's a massive scale exhibition. So
Yeah. Well, and loans
And
in
they-
general are very pricey to begin with,
yeah,
depending on where you're shipping them to.
yeah,
And it's interesting, I don't know the answer to that question, but if it were a source of income, obviously, with most institutions in the country being shut down for a year plus in the last
Yeah.
2 years, that would have curtailed that source of income too, like so many others. And, I think it's worth noting that the challenges that we just touched upon are exacerbated, and also transformed by the pandemic. And I think we had two things happening at once in the last couple of years. We had a pandemic, a global health crisis, and we also have like real increased social and cultural demands on museums to do a lot more than display art, to think about social justice, think about their constituency in different, more, race and gender conscious ways. And those pressures do collide, they intersect. We know that during COVID, museums shut down, right? So there was no revenue from ticket sales. There were no trips. There were no events. There were no concerts. There was none of that. No one was going to the gift shop, And in general, people probably weren't buying from the gift shop online, right? Because they were buying gym equipment or whatever they were buying for their home. So all of that sort of earned income that was, supporting operating expenses at least a little bit was kind of wiped out. We also saw huge staff reductions. So we, and really just massive revenue loss across the board in the art nonprofit sector, which, the American Alliance for the Arts, I believe is the name of the organization, has done great research on, has a bunch of statistics on their website. But, it's just a colossal impact on an industry that's already struggling to raise funds for its operation. So, these are public charities, but they are not public entities in the way that arts institutions are in Europe, in continental Europe. And so there's no government fallback. Luckily, our government provided two main grant opportunities for that museums could qualify for, like many other small businesses. One was the PPP loans that everyone knows about, paycheck protection, and something called the Shuttered Venue Operating Grant, which some museums qualify for. And those were ways to get government assistance that I think actually could be very meaningful for smaller organizations, and many nonprofits took advantage of them. But this is a very difficult time, and a lot of fundraising, like we said, even at the grant and donation level, which again is what museum fundraisers really target, is around schmoozing and like events for wealthy people, making them feel important. And and that wasn't happening. You weren't having dinners, you weren't having private walkthroughs, you weren't doing any of that personal stuff, that personal touch that I think fundraisers really rely on. And at the same time, we started to see much more intensely in the last few years, and still demands on museums to spend money differently, and to spend more money on salaries, which are operating expenses, more money on programming for communities, and general kind of diversity, equity, inclusion type activities. And that's not free. It's expensive. Museums are not places that typically pay high salaries for regular staff members. And it's not like they have a repository of money that they're, could be paying higher salaries. They use it for other things, namely the storage and care of an art collection, which is hugely expensive, right? I mean, if you think about a donation of art, which is a wonderful thing, right? it's actually quite a burden on a museum, and museums are very selective now about what art they accept as donations, because it's really an invitation to pay for the care of that art for perpetuity. So it's just like a cost center. And if you think about the amount of art that you don't see on the wall that has to be in climate controlled storage, inventoried on a regular basis, it's astronomical, and those expenses didn't go away with the pandemic. So there's some challenges related to the global situation, and some tensions in what museums are being asked to do and want to do, and how their budgets and fundraising are currently structured.
For
sure.
I just have one quick comment. I was right before this, I was watching a webinar about traveling exhibitions, and Max Anderson, who used to be the director of the Whitney and also I think Dallas Museum of Art, was talking about how art museums versus other kinds of museums were affected differently, because ticket sales, gate receipts, are much less of a factor for art museums than they are for, say, a science museum, which could, it could depend, maybe 70% of its earned income comes from gate receipts. And so as a result, the pandemic actually hasn't hurt art museums as much, because, people weren't going as it affected other kinds of museums, especially smaller ones. So, but, again, that just puts the emphasis back on, finding donors. So,
yeah. And let's not forget that, most art museums are small, operating small, not in New York City, not in LA, not in San Francisco. They're operating on a hair-thin margin all the time. I think it's fair to say that those are the types of institutions most affected, most vulnerable to the pandemic. And I think there was, in that type of institution, a tremendous amount of vulnerability. Either places did close, or there, was real fear at a lot of those institutions that they would close for good. We have to remember that places like the Met and MoMA, I don't know, the PMA, a handful of institutions have gigantic endowments. They're not allowed to spend those endowments, but they are allowed to spend certain portion of the income on those endowments. And those rules were even loosened, at least by the AEMD, which is sort of the ethical overlay that art museums follow for many, many things, including spending and fundraising. And, they can survive, right? They will survive. The Met was not going to shut down. Was the Met in a dire situation? For sure. Very difficult. That's why we see these institutions, in the headlines about deaccessioning in such a controversial way, because even the big institutions need to find money in different ways. And deaccessioning, has always been a temptation, always been a fraught area in which, institutions think about how they can raise money. If not for operating expenses, what we call direct care of collections. So it's not that they didn't face pressures, but there's a very different situation with very, small arts institutions.
That was the one thing, or that has been something that I know I've struggled with the AMD resolution, because if you look at the, the qualifications of it, or the fine print, if you will, unless you are a very large organization that is deaccessioning something that's going to fetch quite a price at auction, I don't see how the small bit of interest that you could earn off of that, or whatever the interest could be, would be enough necessarily to pay for any kind of bill of an organization. So I always felt very, it was just interesting the way that information was rolled out through news organizations or other things, but to really look into the weeds of it, it's actually really challenging still. It's not like we were told to go out and sell everything and, pay your lighting bills and pay your staff. We're still pretty restricted as arts organizations specifically, when it comes to direct care and the use of those funds. And for this 2-year window, maybe not. And maybe
Right.
Other organizations have always been very transparent about their direct care process, and they've just always been participating in that, and it doesn't matter. But it's interesting because you think about, we talked about some of the challenges that have arose specifically with COVID. And I know with fundraising at my current organization, we had actually developed a new position in development all based on corporate fundraising. And that just became non-existent once the pandemic hit. So organizations that may have otherwise been supporting the arts or supporting nonprofits, you know, the places they wanted to support were healthcare and other organizations that were directly fighting to make an impact on the pandemic. And so like the allocation of funds that we may have expected to receive culturally in the US were being pushed to other organizations that were considered more dire.
Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you raised that, because in the the potpourri of things that come up with this topic, I'm going to forget many. And that's really an important one, is that I think we saw both corporate donors, we'll just call, you know, these private donors, whether they're corporate or they're individuals, you know, get a little nervous about funding as usual. What the pandemic was going to mean for them and their. Did I just freeze, guys?
One quick second, yeah.
Yeah, but you're back now.
Sorry, I froze, didn't I?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know where I was, but I was reacting to Amanda's excellent point, which was that, and forgive me if I'm repeating some part of what people heard, was that, you know, private donors, corporate donors, or individuals, family offices, you know, became nervous, like we all did during the pandemic, about what was going to happen to their own financial well-being, which is a ridiculous thing to say, because I'm sure that, I mean, we know they'll be fine, but their sort of financial positioning in terms of how much giving they wanted to do. We lived in an uncertain economic time. I think that for the most part is probably not playing out. But I think it did give pause to corporate donors and individuals about how they wanted to spend their money. The other thing that happened is that there was a lot of increased pressure and desire around the election, around, you know, Donald Trump's entire presidency and the end of it, around the racial justice reckoning that is, you know, still at the forefront of, you know, our socio-cultural political landscape, to give money to organizations that had to do with those pressing social political issues. And art museums, you know, are not that. And so I think there is also was maybe kind of a redirection of giving to more political social justice causes from wealthy liberal donors that museums, you know, have to deal with. And one way they're trying to deal with that is by acting like they're social justice actors themselves. You know, everyone has their own opinion about whether museums are sort of the proper venue for those types of issues, whether they can do that well, whether it's their job, or, you know, or whether that's better left to other organizations, or whether every single organization that can should be engaging with those issues. So, but I think both of those things, exactly what you're saying, Amanda, were, you know, kind of dried up certain sources of funding, apart from the fact that, you know, there were no ticket sales or no gift shop purchases or stuff like that.
So John, I don't want to neglect our chat. Any feedback we're getting there that we should address?
No, it's all pretty quiet. That must mean Katie's answering all the questions and anticipating everyone's comments. I do have a question. Has any legislation changed as a result of the pandemic that might encourage people to donate more?
That's a good question. I'm not a tax lawyer, but I am not aware of any. And I think what you mean is, are there changes in sort of how in the Internal Revenue Code that would incentivize further or de-incentivize charitable giving? There are always proposals to, you know, change around the edges the incentives for charitable giving, both in terms of how much someone can donate compared to their income or, for a certain tax benefit. You can give as much as you want, obviously. So we're just talking about thresholds for giving that tax advantage you in different ways. And, there were some slight changes in the recent tax legislation, but no, around the pandemic, I don't know that the IRS, was able to or did further incentivize giving. I think one thing, as Amanda was saying, just to take a step back about what the AAMD did, the AAMD is not a legal organization. There's nothing legal about their guidelines. Institutions do not have to follow them. I will say, as I've said in many of these talks, that in New York State, we do have regulations that govern most museums founded after the 1880s that do place restrictions on both deaccessioning and the use of funds from deaccessioning. And that is in the statute, that is statutory law. So in New York, we do have legal restrictions on many things about how public charities operate that are governed by the New York State regents. But one of them is deaccessioning. So, but in general, museums, art museums follow the AAMD guidelines because they see some benefit of being affiliated with that organization, even if they don't have to. I wonder if that is going to change. There's just been more and more dissatisfaction and frustration with the restriction that AAMD has always had, which is that you can, if you properly deaccession, and that's a whole different question, no one's really debating that. There's some different reasons that it's appropriate to deaccession a work, like it's damaged, it's duplicative, things like that. How do you use the proceeds? And the AAMD rule has always been that you can only use the proceeds to acquire new works for the collection. No operating expenses, nothing to care for the collection. You can only buy new work. So that's not really helpful. It's not really a fundraising factor at all. It can be helpful if a new important work, let's say, comes up at auction or in a private sale and the museum thinks it's critical for its collection. Absolutely. Deaccessioning is appropriate and purchasing a new work for the collection is appropriate. But it gave institutions very little leeway to pay for things like curatorial time, storage, conservation, things like that, which the broader museum community, such as the American Alliance of Museums, always permitted. They always also have restrictions on deaccessioning and guidelines, but have for longer. And now, general tax guidance is the same, that you can use the proceeds from deaccessioning to buy new works, but also for the direct care of collections. It was really just in the art museum world that this rule was so strict. And I think we see with the pandemic, just this increased financial pressure on these kinds of institutions and, even more frustration at that kind of strict rule. So AAMD reacts to that, not by changing its rule, not even by changing its rules temporarily, but by saying that for 2 years, they will not sanction you if you violate their rules. And it's a very kind of nuanced approach because there is a difference. They didn't say it's okay to do this. They just basically said, we'll look the other way if you use the funds from deaccessioning objects in your collection to pay for the direct care of a collection. And you must have a collection management policy and all that stuff, but we'll look the other way for a couple of years. So AAMD did not really change. It did not open itself up to a discussion on this. And I think that's angered a lot of museum directors and institutions, especially younger, more, we'll say maybe more progressive, or you just less traditional or less, just a younger mindset of museum director just doesn't get that. That doesn't make sense to them. They have a trove of objects that are not on display. They're largely in storage, just sucking up money for storage and care expenses. And they have all these needs for engagement with the community, for paying better salaries, for like we've discussed, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. They have all of these financial needs, and they have this hugely valuable trove of objects that aren't on display. And I think there's public pressure because if you're not in the art world, that seems ridiculous. Like, I've heard many people say, just sell a painting, of course, then you'll get all the money you need. We have an art world that's the hottest it's ever been. This art is the most valuable it's ever been. So it seems like a very easy way out. The danger is that it is an easy way out. And once these objects are gone from the public view, they are gone. They're in private hands. They will likely not come back, or at least not for decades. And if these institutions hold these objects in a kind of public trust, then selling them because you couldn't otherwise figure out your budget feels like a violation of that trust. That's the tension. But I think many museum directors are now questioning why that rule has to be so absolute in a time where there's so many other pressing financial concerns. And so we will see whether either AAMD yields or whether AAMD becomes less relevant.
All great points. Thanks. And we kind of touched on a few things a little bit earlier. We were talking about donor support and other types of support and some of the social unrest that's been bubbling to the surface in the US over the last few years. So it's a nice segue to talk a little bit about some of the pressures that institutions are being impacted by, especially as of late, with regards to some of the fundraising that they've received by certain types of donors, and kind of the shift that the public is asking museums or institutions to take in response to those types of gifts.
Yeah, we'll call this the Sackler problem, maybe. Yeah, no, I mean, that's totally another thing that's happening right now. And it is very much a fundraising issue and also a social reputational issue. I think as we talk, I'm realizing that there's this collision of all those issues on so many of these topics. So for a long time, museums took money from whatever wealthy donors wanted to give to them. And in some ways, like I said, that makes like kind of total logical sense, right? Once the money's in the charitable bubble, it's not benefiting the Sacklers. I mean, technically, we'll talk about the reputational aspect of that in a moment. It's at whatever institution it's at, and they can use it for good. So great, we just took money from, it's like a Robin Hood issue. We just took money and we're giving it to a good cause. And what could be the problem? I think we've seen a change culturally and politically around just how we react to people, families who've done bad things, and how that can be kind of an absolute bar on their participation in society. And one way we're seeing that is just this concern that wealthy donors, let's say like the Sacklers, are using money potentially that they got from opioid sales, the marketing of opioids, that was of tremendous harm to many people in our country. And then they use those profits to give to an art museum, and their name goes on the wall and they look like wonderful people. That just feels icky. And I think feels icky to a lot of us who aren't, necessarily as absolute, aren't outside a museum protesting about, every board member that's maybe ever done anything questionable, because to be honest, that strategy would lead to no wealthy people on any board, probably. But it just feels kind of icky. So I think that especially with the Sacklers, in the last few years, as everything's become, much more intensely political in certain parts of the country from the left, there's more of a demand to pay attention to whose names you're affiliating with as an institution. And so that is leading museums to think about donations in more reputational ways. And that is kind of in direct tension with the reputational benefit that those donors want. Like we already said, museums are competing for a small handful, the same people, to give a ton of money. What do those people decide to give to one institution or another? Because they get recognition and they feel nice and important and their name gets on something. And now museums are feeling like, oh no, I have to be so careful about what name I put on something, because I don't know in 10 years what's this person going to do? What's going to be uncovered about what they've done in the past, or how they raised their money? I don't know. And so I do think we're seeing a big shift in terms of diligence and discretion about accepting major donations and from who, in terms of diligencing the donor, any reputational concerns that may already exist, and also putting in more, trying to, if you have the power to do that as an institution, more caveats and restrictions in the donation agreements, or naming agreements, which might say something like, this naming right lasts for 10 years. Right? Not forever. Or this naming right lasts for 20 years, but if XYZ happens, we have a right to take your name off and you can't do anything about it. And those could be really general things like bring the museum into reputational harm or something like that. So we're absolutely seeing more hesitancy and also more, I think, diligence on the governance level and protections on the contractual level in terms of giving by people because of these reputational concerns.
I wonder, do you think that because of how some of those recent donations or historical affiliations have gone down over the last few years, do you see an incentive for donors to change their approach? I mean, if the incentive on their end is the name recognition or the positive impact they want to have on their community or on their own selves or their own organizations, if their name becomes the problem, will they change their approach? And if they do, is there still a benefit to them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think from the museum side, you want every donation to be anonymous, right? Like, that would be terrific. No one's going to get angry, come protest outside your museum. Like, it'd be great. It's just, and then honestly, every donation should be anonymous, because if your goal, as a philanthropist is to really benefit the recipient of your funds, then your name doesn't need to be attached to that. Like, it's not about you. So in an ideal world, absolutely all donations would be anonymous or close to anonymous, because they just make all these issues go away. I think what you're asking is really interesting. So to me, it's obvious that from a museum perspective, of course they want that. That saves them this whole PR headache. And they don't need to worry as much about all those caveats. I think from the donor perspective, I don't know. It would be interesting if more donors now are amenable to anonymous donations, or, as many people feared, they're not giving anymore, because what they want is a public affiliation, and museums are not as likely to give it. And if they can't get that, they're going to spend their money somewhere else. So that's the fear, that they'd lose interest, because that's a carrot for a donor. But it may be that there are enough tax benefits, or they really care about the arts, that there is a shift towards giving anonymously just to avoid that embarrassment, or because the museum asks them to, and there's sort of a mutual understanding that this is the direction things are going. So I think that's a really great question. And I would be interested to see over time from the donor perspective, if donors, are just as willing to give and understand that giving anonymously is beneficial in some ways, or if they that's part of why we're starting to see maybe fewer big donations from individuals, at least not from foundations.
Right.
So I do think what would be impacted is, if you go to the Met, when you see a fountain or a wing, it has a name on it. And that's not just like a gift to the donor. That donor paid for that wing or that fountain because it was going to be called their name. So we may just see fewer things like that. We may see fewer fountains that actually no one really needed anyway, called, named after someone, or there may just be fewer projects like that, which I don't know if that would be particularly bad.
A quick comment here. Right after the AAMD resolution came out last year in late April, we had then board president Brent Benjamin on, and we had a live chat with him about this. And someone from one of the listeners proposed, naming or public acknowledgement of donors that would give money to museums, not for works, not for wings nor capital projects, but for whether it's direct care or just salaries or collections care, paying staff, and just making that public acknowledgement. And he actually thought it was a really good idea. But that's really what we need. We need money. We need an endowed head registrar position. What we need, we need money that's not going to be tied to just acquisitions or things like that. But, for all of these other services that come in that are not, that are hard. It's hard to put your name on the painting racks, but that's what you need, right? You need, money to pay that HVAC bill, because that is a huge expense. So.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the age-old struggle. It's just harder now, but it's always been the struggle. Is how do you get money for operating expenses? Yeah. And it's intention, right? Because your operating expenses go up every time there's a new special project. So we're seeing, like, we all see this at big museums. It's like the beautiful, cool new traveling exhibitions, or the flashy thing. And that's wonderful. But like the old Masters wing, or, the antiquities wing, like, that's still so important, and that's still there and needs to be cared for. And kind of like, there really is this attention diversion to these new kind of flashy, not necessarily as traditionally fine art related projects. So I think museums, that's where they can raise money the easiest. So they're really being pulled in that direction, even though what they need the money for is the stuff John talked about, right? And the traditional collections. So no, how do we get the biggest donors to give to operations and not care at all that, won't be as sexy? It won't they won't be able to say that they funded the next fashion exhibit, or, whatever it is a challenge. Yeah. But if the idea of kind of giving them special recognition, maybe beating them at their own game, is a really good one, as long as there's no reputational crisis.
That's true. I'm still holding out hope that I can convince our development department to get someone to fundraise the costs for maintaining and sustaining our collections management system. Someone's got to be interested out there that wants to pay the money for that. I think, but as we said, it might be harder to raise money for.
And, that's so critical, right? Because if smaller museums, or any museum, but I think it's just probably more challenging for smaller museums, aren't keeping track of their collections. What a sad thing, both for scholarship and for the longevity of the institution. That kind of archiving and digitizing is how museums are going to transition into a new era, a new era that's existed for like 30 years, but we're still transitioning into. I have seen, I don't have an expertise on this. I've just noticed that some museums have gotten grants to do that work. They get a grant to digitize, and let's Mellon and Ford, and there were some emergency grant making around the pandemic, not related to collections management necessarily, but just maybe we'll see the kind of foundation step in to fund these kind of more basic needs continue, because I do think we saw the major foundations really step up to the extent they could during the pandemic. But yeah, very important.
How's the chat living over there, John?
Still pretty quiet, but yeah, you're doing great.
Well, it might be a good point for us to talk a little bit about the future of fundraising, which you just touched on a little bit, Katie, and what some opportunities might be post-COVID, in general in the US? How can institutions possibly move forward successfully in the coming year?
John had mentioned, and then I read a little bit more about this, that, arts institutions, like apparently everyone else in the art world, is getting, looking at NFTs. I don't know really how much American art museums are doing that. And we could do a whole talk just on NFTs, which, are a digital asset. They're a token of digits. They are not an artwork. They're not even a digital artwork. They likely point to a digital artwork somewhere on the website that literally anyone can look at or download, but you don't have any rights to that. All you own is the token. So it's kind of a fiction. It's a new asset affiliated with an artwork, but it is not an artwork itself. So I find it hard to understand the appeal of, and I'm skeptical of the longevity of NFTs, but and NFTs connote nothing for copyright. So if you don't have the copyright to something, owning an NFT doesn't give you any rights to use the image more than any other person on earth. I guess some museums, and maybe John can talk a little bit more about what he's been reading, are doing this because people think NFTs are cool. And while people think NFTs are cool, even if I don't understand the value of them, like, why not, create a token affiliated with a work that's in the public domain and sell 10 of them, or, one of them. And if someone wants to spend a lot of money, terrific, So I don't know a lot about that, but I am interested in whether museums do that.
Do you have any comments you want to add there, John?
No, I think it's a way for it sounds like it's sort of a crowdsourcing of a specific project that museums are doing. So like it was the Whitworth that's in the greater Manchester area in the UK that very publicly, just did this and used the proceeds of the NFT sales for community related activities or events. And it was I don't know how successful it was. It's ongoing, but regardless, I think, and there are other people doing it as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds, and still developing. But I think it maybe it gives the public some skin in the game regarding what they see and what they're willing to because they're actively contributing to putting it on. So I mean, I guess they do anyway if they go through the door and pay, but it's not tied specifically to an exhibition the way the NFT is. So I think that could be an interesting thing. Usually I think it's been like the Uffizi did something, but they did an NFT of an actual work. And I think, what we're seeing now is that when people do it, that's problematic. And, you really should be doing something, an image or something that is not the actual work, not an image of the actual work, of the actual Mona Lisa, of the actual Michelangelo or whatever. But regardless, I mean, that's a whole other webinar.
but maybe, I think it does relate to we're seeing a more virtual world of participation. Yeah. Certainly in terms of accessing museums, I see there being virtual programming forever. Whether the public will stay as interested in it, maybe they will, right? Because you could live anywhere and you could still experience the Met while it was shut down. How exciting. I personally was too pandemicked out to participate online and all that kind of stuff after a while, but and that is cool, right? Like you could live anywhere in the world and you could have such increased access to these incredible institutions in a way that 3 years ago you couldn't, because you would have, you'd plan your trip to New York and you'd go to the Met, but you couldn't go to the Met if you weren't in New York. So I think we'll see more of that. And maybe on the fundraising side too, we will, there was a huge effort to do virtual fundraising, virtual galas, virtual, special events, curator talks, tours, whatever. I don't know how successful those were, but I can, imagine that now that infrastructure is set up, it won't go away entirely. And so maybe we will see a more digital fundraising environment, both in terms of online events, but also these sort of digital assets, that can be monetized.
Yeah, for sure. Especially as the landscape of fundraising continues to change in general, pandemic aside. But in many of the ways that you've just said, Katie, we've been forced to kind of pivot ourselves. The things that end up being successful or sustaining through the other side of this will probably be things that institutions can look towards as fundraising sources, even if it is just an NFT of a copy of something that people want to buy because it's cool.
I think there is maybe a summary thought to almost conclude on is that there will be tension though, because there just is no way for most institutions to raise enough money to do what they do without going after big donations from a handful of people. And if at the same time those institutions are trying to seem detached from reliance on wealthy individuals and protected from any criticism about that affiliation, and I think the progressivism of museum messaging and the views of the staff do not align perfectly with the reality of how museums do make their money. And until someone comes up with a plan and explains, okay, well, if you lose all this high net worth individual fundraising, here's how you're going to get the money, here's the other way, I think we're just going to be caught in a kind of like in between, double speaky, just difficult place where museums want two things, and the public's demanding that of them too. So I'm excited to hear how more people, intelligently explain how it'll be possible to work under a different model in the system we are in America, the philanthropic system we have now.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Katie. This has been a great chat. And I hope the people that were able to participate or that will catch the podcast when it comes out later this week will get something out of it, a little hope, hopefully, as well. Mm-hmm. Anywho, guys, go ahead and check out the Art Law podcast. Like we said, we'll link it in the description box below, and we'll link Katie's information and her co-host's information down there as well. And it'll be in the description for the podcast as well. Next Arts Chat is coming up in November. We'll have a couple of pre-recorded sessions we'll have ready for you guys with some of our new help with Meg and Kristen. And I won't delve too deep in that. We'll keep that one a surprise, and you guys will find out a little bit more about it later. But that's all for us this week. Do you have anything else you need to add, John?
Nope. Podcast coming out Friday.
That's right. All right, you guys. We'll catch you next month.
Thank you so much.